Hello friends, I am Shelly Clough, and today I wanted to dive in and show you all some really helpful brush strokes to practice. If you are new to watercolor or you're wanting to get better, particularly at things like flowers or landscapes, I wanted to show you some brush strokes that you can practice to improve those skills. So let's dive in. So I have here today a Princeton Neptune brush. It is a size 6. Any supplies that I use, I will link down below. I also have my starter palette. I sell these on my website, or I have links to all the colors if you just want to purchase tubes of your own paint. And I am going to show you some of the brush strokes I find most helpful for teaching how to paint in watercolor. So the first thing you want to learn with watercolor is the range of your brush. So every watercolor brush, well, most of the time, we're using round brushes for watercolor, and they collect to a nice point at the end, and then they have a thicker body. So this brush works like a mop. It's going to hold a lot of water for you, but also that thin point is to give you a range of strokes that you can create. So I'm just going to dive into a color here. I'm going to dive into, this is quinacridone magenta, and I'm going to just get my brush kind of loaded up. So I'm just dipping in the water, getting this paint activated and creating a little puddle I can work from. And then once I load my brush up, giving it a swirl in the paint, I will swipe it a few times on the palette to make sure that I don't have any droplets of water that are in here. You'll also notice when you press your brush off on the palette, your bristles will collect in a certain place. So if you rotate your brush, one part of it will probably be most thin, another part might be wider because that's where the bristles collected. So it's helpful to rotate your brush to find where the thinnest point is. And we are just going to practice some super thin lines. And even if they have little breaks in them like this, that is desirable. Okay, so don't worry about your line being perfectly connected. Even I feel like lines with little breaks like that are more visually appealing anyway. And you just want to practice seeing how thin of a line you can get with your brush. And this is where the brush you're using matters quite a bit and why you might choose one brush over another. So this Princeton Neptune brush, it's meant for very wet and sort of expressive painting. And the tip doesn't get as thin and precise as brushes of some other brushes that I have. So for example, this is one I've used before that you guys really loved. It's the the Escoda Perla brush in a size 12. And you can see the tip on this is super precise and thin. So when I use this brush, come and I get some of that same color and I go to make just the thinnest little line. You see how tiny and thin I can get that line? I just can't make that line on my Neptune brush. The bristles just aren't made to go in a point like this one is. So this brush has a really pronounced range. So what I mean by range is I can do that super thin line, and then as I press my bristles down, I can make a wider line. It's kind of like calligraphy, if you've ever done that, where your pressure on the pen increases the width of your stroke, and then as I lift again, that starts to get smaller until I can go back to that really thin point. So this brush has quite a range. So let's compare the Princeton Neptune brush for a range here. So if I start really thin, as light a pressure as I can, and then I start to press down. This is also a smaller brush, so that wide part is not going to get as wide, but it also doesn't get as thin. But so this, you can see that. So this is the Perla Escoda brush, and this is the Princeton Neptune brush. I love this brush for certain purposes. This one is especially nice when I'm painting things that are more rounded. So this brush is great for a stroke like this, if you're trying to make sort of squared off strokes. So this is another brush stroke to practice where you're using the belly of the brush to create some shapes. So you want to make almost little oval shapes or little rectangles. You can make them straight up and down, kind of curved. But this helps you, again, you're getting comfortable with the range on your brush. And so let's switch to the Escoda brush, and we'll just take a look at that same range. These shapes are a lot more precise because that tip is precise. I'm getting more of a square shape here. It's a little harder to get soft edges on a brush that's really precise like this. So when I want more of these rounded shapes, I will go for more like a Neptune brush. And when I want shapes that are a lot more precise with kind of crisp and squared off edges, then I will opt for a brush that has a nicer point like this. So you can create rounded shapes with a brush like this. You can see that this shape is much rounder than this one, but it just requires a little more practice and precision. But it's just hard to get rid of a point, which most of the time is great. But there's perks to the different brushes. That's why I like having a few different brushes to choose from. But this stroke again, so we now have seen how thin our stroke can get, and now we've seen kind of this wider stroke that it can create. So now we're going to practice some more of this sort of calligraphy-esque motion where we go from light pressure to heavy pressure to increase the width of our line. This one is really great for practicing in order to paint leaves and petals and things like that. I use this stroke all the time in painting florals. It's really helpful to have some experience with it. So if I am going to come here, you want to start very light pressure, just like as soft as you can on the bristles of your brush, trying to get that tiny point and using that. And then you're going to press, and you're always moving forward as you're pressing. And you press, and you can even wiggle your brush a little, and it will really fan out those bristles. And then we're going to start to lift the brush as we're moving forward still. So we're lifting the brush as we move forward, and we lift till we come back to that really precise point on our brush. Okay, and so this could be something where you can practice going back and forth. So you start thin, press down, and come up, and press down, and come up, and just do that back and forth for a while. And it will help you to get used to that motion. A couple other things this helps you with is you see how long of a stroke I was able to make without re-dipping my brush in the paint. This will help you get acquainted with how much water you need on your brush and how far that will get you depending on the size of the stroke that you are creating. And the size of your brush will change how far you can paint. So if we switch back to our size 6 brush, if I come in here and I swirl in that paint again, we're going to try to do the same thing with the Neptune brush. So I start thin and I press, and thin and press. So this brush was able to cover that whole spectrum just as well, but because it's made to hold so much water, you do have to be a little more careful about kind of striping or puddling that can happen. And really these sort of marks can be very fun in a loose and expressive kind of playful painting. And then as you are trying to paint more precise and realistic, you probably want your paint to be a lot smoother. So I feel like this is not necessarily bad. It's just a difference in style of painting that the brushes are suited for. This brush, the Escoda brush, really is a higher end brush. It's just more expensive to purchase. And it's made to be a very professional style brush. So it is going to be less apt. The Princeton brush is like a mid-range brush. It's not a beginner. It's not an expert. It's sort of good mid-range. I love these brushes and recommend them all the time. But there's just differences in the way that they function. So now let's take this stroke that we've been working on, the kind of pressure up and down, and we're going to create some leaf shapes with it. So I'm just going to rotate my paper so that I don't have to worry about sticking my hand in that. And I'm going to make some leaves. So I'm going to start with that light pressure and then press down as much as I can and lift. And now I've got a nice leaf shape that I have made. And you can practice doing that. It looks really easy when I do it. I have students all the time that get frustrated when they try this for the first time because it does take practice. But once you are quick with it, it's such a fun way to paint. So I'm just swirling back in my paint, light pressure, pressing down, and coming back up. Now you can also make your leaves wider by combining 2 of these strokes together. So if I start with 1 stroke and lift, and then I'm going to come and sort of press this way. and come to that same point. And now I have a wider leaf that I have created. So we can do a couple of those. And so you can see I'm kind of pushing the brush as I lay that stroke down. I'm not going in a perfectly straight line. I'm sort of curving the brush up and down. So here I kind of press it down a little and then scoop back up. I like to leave little slivers of white when I make my leaves. So press up and back down. These are super helpful strokes. And then when we take that same stroke and you turn it, if you've seen my video on how to paint roses, we paint roses with that same stroke. We start really small, and then as we get larger with our petals, we're doing that light pressure, press down and lift, but we're doing it in a curved shape. So we're creating little crescents, but that same pressure where we've got the tapered ends that are a little bit smaller and the wider belly. And you can add little waves to that stroke, and it will serve you really well to learn how to use the pressure on your brush to create some shapes. So I'm making these shapes really distinct just to help you see kind of what I'm doing. But that shape, as you sort of layer them on top of one another, you can create really lovely flowers, particularly roses, with that one brush stroke. Okay, so I just grabbed a new paper here and we're gonna work on some other brush strokes. So I'm going to we're just gonna switch up colors just for fun. I'm gonna come into this indigo color. I want these colors to be dark enough that you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so this brush stroke, starting with a new paper here, this is just going to be for you to practice loading up your brush with enough water and sort of getting good water control. So what you want to do is really swirl your brush and your paint, and we're just going to make a line across as long of the page as we can. So I'm just running this brush all the way across. So you can see here, this is where I've got heavy water on my brush. This is like a really nice wetness right in here. And then as I come over this way, it starts to dry out and you can see this scratchy texture start to appear. This is where the paint and water is really running out of my bristles. And again, this is affected by the type of brush that you have, as well as the size of brush. A larger brush is going to hold more water. So if I switch to this size 12 again, and I use that same paint, and then we're going to try to do a stroke as long as we can with this. And that's actually not too different, a little more even, but you can still see that scratchy texture start to appear. But practicing this and getting a feel for like the amount of pigment and water that you need in order for paint to go certain lengths is really helpful. So I'm just going to run this along all the way to the other side. And it will help you know, especially if you tend to paint too dry and you feel like you're having to make lots of strokes to get the paint to cover the area that you want, you can work on this stroke and loading up your brush and just making these stripy lines. Okay. Now, another skill that you can practice is what's called softening an edge. So softening an edge is when you have some paint that you have laid down and the edge is very crisp. So if I come over here and I make this mark, maybe I want the edges of this mark to be more diffused than they currently are. They are very crisp edges. Sometimes that's exactly what you want. Sometimes you want those edges a little softer. So what I can do is I can make my mark, give my brush a rinse in the water, and then dab it on my paper towel so it's clean and damp. And then take that damp brush and I'm just going to run that along the edge that I want to soften. See that? Now that color is much more diffuse. So on this side we have a crisp edge, and on this side we have a soft edge. So that is called softening an edge. And this can be really helpful, especially if you are layering and you feel like your layers are too harsh. So if I bring back this paper here and I want to maybe I came and I did a layer on top of this leaf and I'm like, ooh, those are just too harsh and it doesn't look very blended or natural. I do that rinse and dab, and then I can take that damp brush and re-wet that color and sort of diffuse it so that it goes where I want it to go. Maybe I move some of the color and just rinse, dab, and you can rework with a color that you've already laid down. So that is where that can be super helpful. It's really nice when you are painting a landscape, maybe you're painting clouds and you want to diffuse the edge of a cloud. Softening an edge works great for that. So we're just going to practice that a few times. Let's do it together. So I take my nice dark paint and I'm just going to make kind of a straight mark there. It doesn't really matter what the mark looks like. I'm just going to do a couple of those marks and then rinse and dab, and then just come along that edge of that color, and I'm just loosening that color there. Okay, we can do it again. I always want to make sure my brush is clean, otherwise it's going to be putting down pigment instead of just moving the pigment that I've already laid down. So just kind of running my brush over that edge to loosen that color up. Now, something you might notice if you have a line that's already quite dry. So I painted this a few minutes ago. If now I want to soften the edge, I can't just touch the edge. I can still move this paint. If I kind of scrub at the edge there, you can see that that color lifts and I am getting that sort of diffused look. But because this whole area is dry, it's now creating a harsh line where the wet and the dry area meet. So if you're wanting to soften an edge over paint that's already dried, you want to wet the whole area that you are trying to work with so that all of that paint gets reactivated, and then it will be kind of a smoother gradient and you don't end up with that harsh line. So there's sort of the difference there. When I wet the whole area, now it's a smooth gradient from top to bottom here. And then wherever you have dry meeting wet, you're going to get a little line like that. And some other brush strokes that can be helpful is learning how to bend your brush around. And the way that I like to do that is just by having fun with sort of some swooping lines. So if I come back into this pink color, I am just going to practice kind of making like a snake shape. And you don't have to worry about alternating the thickness very much. You can if you want. Like you can practice making one really thin or really thick or alternating. It can be kind of fun to do that. But this will just help you with learning brush control, getting your brush to go where you want it. Sometimes I'll have students who are learning how to use a brush for the first time and they'll end up with things like the brush sort of popping out from under them or not really going where they want it to go. And so practicing exercises like this will help you learn sort of how those bristles move and get comfortable with making sure your brush is always going where you want it to go and it's not sort of running away from you. So you can just do a couple little swooping lines like that. You can even make loops is another great exercise. So those are all things that will help you with your brush control. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple more tips for sort of changing or correcting what you already painted. So one of those things is if you have paint that is somewhere where you don't want it, how do you lift that color off? So if I give my brush, again, a rinse and a dab, so I've got that clean, damp brush, you can sort of use your brush to scrub a color that you've already laid down. So if I just wanted this rectangle to be smaller than it is right now, I scrub at that color and then I rinse and dab again, and it will sort of pick that color up. So I just pick it up, dab it off with my paper towel, pick it up, dab it off. And so this is the closest thing you have, or one of the tools you have for erasing, so to speak, in watercolor. And the longer your color is on the paper, it tends to be a little harder to lift. And then it also depends on the type of paper as well. Some papers are going to lift more completely than others. So again, it's not without flaw. So like on this one, you can sort of see a little remnant of color around where I have lifted that off, but it corrects it enough where if I wanted to paint around this after it dried, I would be able to do that. Okay, another struggle that you might have is if you end up having too much water when you are painting. So if I have my puddle here of paint, really load my brush up, and then I try to paint And I'm just going to really exaggerate this here. I have a ton of water on my paper. And this is more than I want. It's sort of making everything dry slowly. My colors are not diffusing nicely. You can really dab your brush off on your paper towel so it's quite dry. And because it works like a mop, it will pick some of that color back up. So you just run it over where you have excess water, and then it will pick up that color that you've laid down. So that's a great tip for if you have just a little too much paint that's come out, or maybe you didn't realize that your brush had more water on it than you thought. You can use kind of a damp brush to lift water off of your paper to soften up an area with too much water in it. Okay, a few more strokes that you can practice are making smaller marks. Again, this is sort of helping with brush control and just helping create the shapes that you want. But you can practice making tiny little marks with your brush, kind of little flicks like this, just to help you learn to control your brush, kind of get paint where you want it, and show you the range of your brush. This will help you know kind of which brush is the best bet for when you're trying to paint different textures. So if I were to come, my Princeton Neptune brush would not be the brush I would want to use if mostly what I was painting were these little marks. So it can do it. It's not quite as precise as my Escoda brush, but it can still do it. It's just maybe not my first choice. It's a little more difficult to control this than it is the other brush. Another brush stroke to practice is what's called scumbling. Scumbling, you've seen me use in other videos, and essentially it's creating a texture on your paper. And you do that by using the tip of your brush and sort of dancing it around on your paper. And you want to create a variety of larger strokes and smaller ones, and leaving little bits of white space here and there. And you can do these in different shapes. So you've probably seen me do them for flowers, where I'm creating kind of a small circle with this sort of texture. Or I've used it, so scumbling you can do small or you can do large. So if I do kind of the same technique, but I do it a little bit larger, and I'm making bigger strokes with my brush, what I'm trying to do is create some randomness and give a feel of some texture and movement. So these larger strokes are great. I use it a lot if I'm trying to do some kind of background greenery in a painting. You can do this in a green color, and it creates a really nice kind of subtle movement effect in the background. So that is called scumbling. Another stroke that can be helpful is just making kind of where you are like placing your brush down like this, and just using the actual shape of your brush to create a shape. And then you can do this in sort of a pattern. This is again kind of a fun way to add some filler. So I'm just placing my brush at different, I'm using slightly different pressure as I tap it down and sort of clustering some of those marks. And it makes for a really pretty texture in a painting. So that's another little brush stroke that you can practice as well. And this kind of brush stroke is really lovely for the Princeton Neptune. So if I try to do this with the Esconda brush or the Escoda brush, it's so pointy, it's really difficult to create that. So if I come and I try to do it, it's still mimicking that shape, but it's much pointier. It's got such a precise tip, it's really difficult to make kind of a rounded shape with this brush. So there's sort of the difference. I really love the look of this for when I'm going for this sort of texture. So those are kind of reasons I might shift from one brush to another. Okay, lastly, I'm going to show a few more strokes that I think are helpful for painting leaves. So I am going to I'm just going to use this Viridian Green. It's kind of a fun color. And this one I'm going to use the Princeton Neptune brush for. I feel like it works really well for, what I want to show you is how to make more of a rounded leaf shape. So if I am using this brush, what I'm going to do is press my bristles down and give it a little wiggle. And then I'm going to come and lift. Okay, so we're going to do that again. I'm going to press my bristles down, wiggle, and then lift and I'm actually rotating my brush just a little bit as I lift. So let's watch that again. I press the bristles down, I wiggle, and then I kind of rotate and lift. And these are my little rounded leaves. So let's show you if we have kind of a stem that we're working with. We do our nice skinny line, and then we do this press and wiggle, and then lift, and we bring that to the stem. Press and wiggle, and bring that to the stem. It's just a different style of greenery that you can do. And that wiggle in the brush sort of creates a nice texture on the leaf as well. I'm going to press and wiggle and then drag it down. So that is one way that you can do a leaf shape. Now that wiggling motion you can also use for while you're making sort of the pointier leaf. So if we have our basic leaf shape, that's like this, if I want to add a little wiggle to that, I'm going to start light, and then when I press down, do a wiggle with that stroke, and then come do the same thing on the other side. Wiggle, and then come back to a point. So now I have a leaf that has a little bit more texture to it. Let's do that again. So light pressure, and then I'm going to do wiggle, and you can do this more or less pronounced. Do a wiggle here, and sort of fill in that interior section. There's my textured, sort of bumpy, wavy leaf. So here's a couple of different ways that you can paint leaves and be practicing some brush control at the same time and learning those skills. So I hope that that is a great sort of introduction to some brush strokes that you can practice as you are learning watercolor. Let me know what else you would like to learn about, what would be a helpful tutorial for you, but we will see you all in the next video. Thanks so much for watching.